Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Amy Forbes. I'm the training manager from the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Practical Steps to Addressing Bias, Privilege, and Discrimination as a Behavioral Health Professional. This is presented by Bianca Andrews. Please know this webinar is being recorded. A certificate of attendance will be emailed to those who registered and attended, and we are not able to offer CEUs for this webinar. And I'm going to go over just a brief information of our network and some important things before we get started here. The MHTTC is a nationwide network supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA. Our network includes 10 regional centers and a network coordinating office. And you can see in the pink circle above, our Northwest MHTTC covers HHS Region 10, which includes Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. The goals of the Northwest MHTTC are to support mental health-related evidence-based practices, heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the behavioral health workforce, foster alliances and address diversity of training needs, and share free publicly available training and technical assistance. Our area of focus is in evidence-based practices for psychosis, which include CBTP and assertive community treatment, or ACT. We also host a variety of other trainings. You can check those out on our website, where you can register for free webinars or learning communities, watch a recorded webinar, take a free online self-paced course with healthy knowledge. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter, review our resource library, or listen to our podcast called Putting It Together. And for today's webinar, we will send a link to the recording, the slides, as well as your certificate of attendance within a couple weeks after this event. For communication during today's event, please use the chat box to reach out to our staff if you need assistance, or if you would just like to share your respectful comments, greetings, and observations with everyone. Please use the Q&A box to type your questions for our presenter. You can do this at any point throughout the presentation, and we will be monitoring the Q&A box to facilitate answering as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Also, at the end of today's event, we will send out a link to our survey. Please do know that we read the surveys. Your information is really important to the work that we do and the content that we provide. We are required by SAMHSA to conduct this survey, yet they do not have an official position on the content that we provide. And I just want to share some upcoming events that we have. On 8/21, we will host a webinar on de-escalation and personal safety through a trauma-informed lens. And then on 8/29, we will be hosting a webinar on the impacts of climate change on mental health. You can register for both of these webinars via the links that are in the chat or on our website. And now I would like to welcome and introduce all of you to today's presenter, Bianca Andrews.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I do want to say thank you for joining us for this presentation. While I'm speaking, I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen, get things going, put things up there, and technology will work with me because it does appreciate that. Okay. So again, thank you. I do want to take time before I get started, before more introduction about myself, that I do acknowledge the land that I'm actually joining from. I know we have people showing up from different areas, different locations, different time zones. And I just want to give acknowledgement to I'm in Seattle the original lands of the Duwamish tribe, the Duwamish people. And I want to acknowledge that, not just for a statement, but to say this work that we do in behavioral health and mental health and community care, it's important to acknowledge the people whose homelands we are entering, we are guests to, and we join in the work that they've already done in stewarding the land, and to walk forward in that knowledge and recognition. So I just wanted to give that acknowledgement, and hopefully everyone else also think about where you're coming from, where you enter space to do this work, and how you can demonstrate acknowledgement, right? There's the acknowledgement, the recognition, but what can we do in practice? So a little bit about me. I consider myself a queer Indigenous parent, friend, advocate. I'm going to move this over here so you can see that screen. I consider myself a community advocate. I believe community care for all people is important. That collectivistic idea of caring for one another is something I feel is the driving force for me. I'm committed to inclusivity, right? For equity, not just diversity. We have to have diversity of thought, of practice, of care, compassion, but we also have to be inclusive of all people, all the intersections that they show up with, and what those different points of views, perspectives, worldviews are. I have unwavering and relentless support for Indigenous sovereignty. I believe more than acknowledging, but being embracing and being present to what people need, especially if they come from history, from heritage that has been here before Western thought, Western community, Western introduction, colonization. And I also believe nothing changes when nothing changes. I definitely believe that by showing up today, each of you is feeling like you want to be part of that change, or are already part of that change, and showing up to hear even little tidbits that I may be sharing today that's not all new. I think that's also part of the change in this process. And I think that's what we need to have a better tomorrow, to have a better future, to offer better services to folks around us, to offer better care. So that's just a little bit about me. I really like this quote. I want my work to be about healing. I have such an appreciation for so many authors, so many heroes in this work of social justice, of education, of authoring. And bell hooks, the Gloria Jean Watkins, beautiful human being. There's so much to learn, even in the first time I saw her name, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting, you get all this education about capitalization and things, and just understanding she wanted the work to speak first, not just about the individual person. And that stuck with me. And so that really speaks to that piece of community care, of outreach for others. And not that we don't take care of self, but really letting the work speak first, right? And being about healing others and the fellow person, the person next to us. And I really appreciate reading about her work and everything she has to offer, because it really is a focal point that I keep me grounded in what I aim to do, what the work I aim to provide to others. Since we're talking about bias and potentially even talking about racism or other isms, or these things that can take some courage, some bravery to sit in space, even if we're just thinking about it for ourselves, I do want to take a moment before we get started to invite everyone to take a pause and really think about how we enter this space of intention. This is not just about a checklist of ways to not be biased, or to shove away that bias, or acknowledge privilege and try to get rid of it. Or this is really some hard truths that we have to hold for ourselves sometimes. And I want to invite people to come into that space of thinking, not just bravely and courageously, but with intention, right? So taking a moment to visualize what would an equitable and inclusive mental health space look like for you, for people that you love, for the community around you, for the community that maybe you enter it for your work, for your volunteerism. Maybe those are very different communities. And so visualize what that looks like to you, right? What's that goal? What are we aiming for? And then take a deep breath, because sometimes that's so big, it's so much to hold. And we really have to take a deep breath and just let that out, right? We can't do it all the time, but what can we do? And also take care of self. Give yourself a chance to breathe. There's a lot of heaviness in our world, and sometimes we may be part of that impact, even with positive intention. That's a lot to hold. And so we have to take a pause, right? To reflect on what soothes your body. What do you do when you are in distress? What comes up? How do you feel? If you need to take a moment to step away, maybe you're listening to this and not watching, and that's okay, but take a moment to grab what you need. If it's a blanket, if you are a sensory person, if you need your glass of water, your snacks, care for yourself, right? Sometimes we want to be thoughtful in the conversation and we forget about self. What do I need to go into these types of spaces? And even I am feeling like, oh, I've had a lot of coffee and I love this work, and oh, I need to take a deep breath, right? Just like release that we are entering space bravely to have some conversation. And I know it's different in a webinar, but that's the intention of this information, to be about how can this be part of a conversation, especially within the work that we may do, right? We may be bringing in some bias, some privilege. There may be discrimination we are witnessing. We see some racism, some transphobia, things that come up within our work. And how do we hold space to acknowledge that, to see it, recognize it, and then make our next move? And also, ooh, that heaviness, right? So just being mindful to do this as part of this intentional work on bias, on addressing it. So addressing bias, acknowledging, right? We have to acknowledge we all have bias. There could be negative impacts on others. There could be negative impacts on ourselves. Um, are we able to identify? Do we know our blind spots? If we haven't, those are hard to find sometimes. Sometimes they're so ingrained from childhood, from the environment, culture. You've acculturated or assimilated into spaces and you don't even realize, right? But maybe taking some time to identify that. Hot buttons, what gets your cheeks flushed, what gets our temperature going, what gets our heart racing, what makes us start to feel maybe discomfort. What's my responsibility in this process, right? Sometimes we feel I can't solve everything for the world. I can't solve everything for everyone in society. What is my responsibility? So maybe this is a chance to take stock, or at least start to think, what is my responsibility in this? Recognize that there are steps that we can take to overcome bias. We can unlearn some patterns of thinking. It is possible, to say I have bias for so long for so many people, especially if you identify as a white person. Sometimes that's hard to say out loud, and all the scary labels you can be given, right? Like, oh, are you racist? Oh, that must mean, and that must mean this thing about you if you have bias. Well, we all do, right? But what can we do about it? And then lastly, that action. How do we create a strategy for progress, not just for the overall? We all see these systems that are harmful and impact our society, and that can feel overwhelming. But what can we do individually? What can I do to set some things in a different direction? So we'll go ahead and get started talking about acknowledging unconscious bias. Unconscious, right? It's the thing we're not aware of, those things that we aren't clear on. They're not just They may be the things, well, it's just what I grew up with, and how am I supposed to know? What was I supposed to do about it? Well, we acknowledge that exists within all of us. We all come from spaces where we have been taught things. We've grown up, and this is just the way it is. So then I go out into the world, into a different community, and I start to treat people a particular way because that's what I've always done, right? We all have that. So think about your affinity groups, your friend groups. Think about not just diversity of faces, but what do your affinity groups look like? How different, how much diversity of thought is there in your groups, in your work groups? If you identify with certain people, what about those groups feels maybe kind of closed off that you weren't even realizing were closed off? Or is there space to say, how can we open this up a little bit differently? Are we challenging our own biases? Yeah. And is that uncomfortable? Possibly. That's okay. But let's acknowledge where some of that is coming from. Let's acknowledge that it's there. How do you start addressing anything that you're not aware of? And this kind of this work calls us to do that, to acknowledge it, say, what can I do about it? What would it take to have that space to say, let me do some personal reflection, right? Because I think we can all say, oh, I can do that. I can do personal reflection on myself. And sometimes when we enter these spaces around bias, both held bias, what we hold up over others, and even felt bias, what people have put on us, what sometimes becomes a cycle of somebody put this on me, and now I've become a person who thinks about certain people who hold this point of view or who look a certain way or who do a particular thing. I start to hold that bias against them. So when I do that personal reflection, sometimes it doesn't feel good, right? It's like, I don't want to feel bad about myself. I don't want to feel sad or like I'm a bad person. I don't believe I'm a bad person, right? All those things that come up for us. What do you need to do that kind of self-reflective work to take care of self also? Who cares about you? Who do you have in your life that cares about you that would be supportive in these kinds of processes? Sometimes we need people who deeply care about us to say, I'm doing some hard self-reflective work, and there will be times I may not be feeling so good. I need somebody to be there for me, to be kind to me, right? Like when some hard stuff comes up for us. Who would kindly be in brave space that would hold challenging conversations with you, right? Some of this work, we want to do it on our own and we want to get through it. And sometimes because of those feelings that people will judge us for having bias, why would I want to tell somebody, hey, I did some work? There's all kinds of tests online that you can do that are, again, they have their own problematic underlining points of view or perspective, but they can give you just some basic understanding around bias and implicit bias, unconscious bias. But sometimes when doing that work, we don't want to share with others because maybe we're embarrassed. Maybe we're feeling like, oh, if I share with folks that I have bias, and especially if it's ageism, it's something around race, something around transgender, LGBTQIA plus folks, two-spirit folks, how will I be viewed by these people I care about? But do you have people who care about you enough to say, I want to sit in this space and challenge your thinking in a kind way? Do we have those folks? That's important to recognize. It's important for us to recognize in our journey that we are going to need those people. Also, when you acknowledge that, you start to have more awareness of what you see with others. Oh, that's heavy, right? Because once you start seeing what you didn't see before and you want to call it out, you want to talk about it, you got to have your people, the people who care about you to say, I want to sit in space and talk about this. Let's have some challenging conversation and know that this may change relationship, right? So we got to be careful that we enter this type of process knowing we have people who support us, who aren't trying to hold us back, that understand why we're taking on this challenging work, and maybe they want to join us in that at some point. And what a great way to do this in a kind way, not a call out, but more of a call in, right? I need people to hold me to this process that I'm engaging in, but I need them to do it in a way that is going to support me on learning some things and trying some new things. We have to acknowledge the possibility that things that we do has negative impact on others, and sometimes even on ourselves within the behavioral health profession. These are helping professions. I think we all come to mental health, behavioral health work, community care work because we care about people. And sometimes just driving with that, we feel is enough. I care about people. How could anything negative happen from that? How could I do anything harmful if I'm always being driven by I care? But do we understand why it's important to acknowledge that some things we do may have a negative impact? Who does that matter to? It matters to the people we claim that we want to help, right? It matters that we are able to hear, hey, that didn't feel so good. You said this thing, and I know I'm trusting that you came from a good, caring space in what you said or what you did, but I need you to know that impacted me in this way. Can we hold that? What does that feel like, right? That's hard when we've harmed somebody that we care about, especially if it's within our work, this profession that we have maybe had a lot of education, a lot of time studying to get to where you're at, a lot of training. Maybe you've also had some hardship. Maybe you've been impacted by bias along the way, and you feel like I've done so much work to get here, and now someone's saying I've negatively I've hurt them. So what if I don't want to acknowledge that I need to do more? And what if I don't want to do more, right? This work is hard. Society that we live and work in and engage in, without acknowledging it, means we're not going to be doing good work to really understand all the ways the people that we may be claiming we want to help and we want to serve or provide support to, we may not be aware of all the ways they are impacted, not just by us, but by the larger society, different systems, different suggestions we provide them in the work that we do. If we are offering services in a particular way and we don't ever consider if this really is meaningful to who they are, to their cultural norms, to their family of origin, to their people, what's the point, right? Like we're just kind of giving what we think is important to them without ever acknowledging that maybe this doesn't align with them. And in doing so, am I now saying what you think doesn't matter? Yeah, I hope not, but is it possible? Is it possible that I'm saying this is the way to do it? There is no other way. I know best. And that's a tricky space to be in, especially as behavioral health professionals. This work is so challenging already, whether you work in community, in hospital settings, if you work within a client's home, if you are meeting people on the street, in school, whatever system, in the prison system, right? We got to acknowledge all the ways people are impacted, and how do we view each of them in those settings, who they are, how they show up? Are we holding some bias that may be preventing good work or even better work and even more compassionate work? And so I think it's important that we answer these questions for ourselves on why. Do I really believe it's important to tackle bias, to work on it? Do I believe it's possible? Do I believe I need to do more to do that, right? Do I really need to go down this road? This feels hard. This feels like it doesn't feel nice. I want to take care of self and ignore some things. If only we could do so in the world. That identification. What's our responsibility in the behavioral health profession? Why should this be important in this work? Well, it's really easy to come from that frame of I'm not biased. I view things objectively. I accept everyone who comes in the door. I say hi to every face, regardless of how they look, to every person, even if they're not nice to me. I'm objective. I treat everyone. I offer the same treatment no matter what. And there you go. I'm not biased. But a good reframe would be that it exists in everyone, right? Including me. And so knowing that and just acknowledging that gives us a space to then let's identify. Let's identify what that looks like, what it sounds like. Let's identify when it comes up. Let's start to do a little bit more work on ourselves to get to know ourselves a little bit better, right? Sometimes we got to get to know even the not so pleasant things. So those blind spots, what are the hot buttons? How do we respond if somebody starts talking politics and you feel a particular way in any direction? If somebody's talking about it in the grocery store, you're just like, you're ending your day, you're trying to get through this day, and somebody starts talking and it's something maybe different from how you feel, or just very strongly in opposition. Or maybe what they're saying are some words that strongly impact people you care about. How does that feel? Do we just ignore it and just move on? What if you can't ignore it? What comes up for you? What if you're in the workplace and someone brings something up and it's that thing that feels discomfort, or do your cheeks flush? I get red cheeks, definitely. It all shows up on my face. As much as I try, this face doesn't hide much when there are some hot buttons. I can feel the heat rise literally to my cheeks, to my face. My eyes start to do a thing. I might start to get a twitch. It's the stress response for me of, is this the time to say it? We also have to acknowledge, who am I? How do I exist in the world? There are spaces for me. If I share very openly, there are spaces for me where I may hear things that I feel strongly I need to say something. I need to step in and educate, make a comment, say a timeout. I need to challenge this. And then there are times where I have to acknowledge this isn't a safe space for me, right? So even in this work, we have to have some awareness that there, for some of us, there will be times that it maybe doesn't feel safe to say it outwardly. What can we do about that? What does that also feel like? What do we have to do with that when we are exposed to that? And if you are someone who doesn't generally feel you have to worry about that, do you consider if the person next to you, who's your coworker, a person that you are serving, a client, if they are a person who has to stay silent, do you know how to navigate that space, right? We have to think about those things. If we're not thinking about it, sometimes we offer suggestions, we offer, oh, I would just tell them, don't let that guy talk to you that way. Just tell him, this is what I need to share with you. Well, I can't move about the world in every space that way. Right. And so that's something I need you to understand so that you can see it from a different point of view. What causes discomfort in us? What are the areas that we are challenged, especially in behavioral health, mental health work? Do you have bias within the mental health, behavioral health? Do we see people a particular way that maybe sets how you offer services, how you offer care and compassion or treatment or safety suggestions to them look a little bit different because you see them as they need this, they're needy. Oh, here's another one based on a diagnosis. Yep, I know what's coming up. This is how you handle all of them. Or think about what comes up for you. Identify those areas that maybe you've been challenged within your work, both with clients, that people that you get to serve, that you get to support, and coworkers. All of that is important. How do we exist in our workplace and support one another if there are some bias, some stuff that's coming up, maybe that you notice about yourself that you start to feel, oh, there's a reason I work with certain clinicians, certain therapists, and I won't work with certain others. Or maybe you have different roles within your agency, your organization, and maybe you're a person who highlights a particular type of education over another. And so you think, oh, yeah, I know that person has great ideas, but these people are more educated. What could you be missing out on? What other thought patterns could you be ignoring? Also, does degreed education, is that the be all end all way of knowing? There's so much more out there, and especially culturally, there's so much more to learn from others culturally that we could be missing out on. Be open to our own minds too, right? So think about how that may come up, those biases, to identify where those may be coming from, and just again acknowledge. Let me identify some things. Maybe you identify 10, and that can feel overwhelming. Okay, let's start with some priority, right? Let's take some time to help ourselves. Also, the reason to identify is we have to think about how these kinds of biases will impact people we serve, right? There's racism, can't ignore that it happens. I know there are folks who say, yeah, that's an old thing, doesn't happen anymore. Nope, that's not a thing for me. Well, think about how that might impact your work, how you view coworkers, how you view other people getting promotions, maybe. We got to be cautious, right? Also, if people have a very real experience that they share with you about racism, how might you respond to them? You might dismiss it. Well, what does that say about the work we do in behavioral health? When we do know racism does impact one's mental health. It really does, right? So what do we need to do to navigate that frame of thinking? So talked a little bit about this stuff, but I just want to, again, take a moment, pause, take a breath. When we think about these things, are there points where it's like, I get it, or starting to feel angry? Sometimes in these settings, when I do some of this work with other folks in behavioral health or mental health areas, and these are full day conversations, right? So we have to take a lot of breaks. Sometimes we are getting into courageous territory of we're challenging one another to openly say, what are some of these biases that I have? And let me bravely walk into space and share with folks, or just say openly, this is something I want to work through. And I need some kind coworkers, kind people in the room to help me get to that next space. Oh, that's heaviness. Because sometimes we feel like this says a lot about the work that we do and what an attack that can feel like. So think about what may have been coming up as we just talked for a little bit, or as I talked. But think about what comes up, right? How do I navigate that? What do I need? Do I need to take a few more pauses? Maybe I'm not going to tackle it all in one day. Maybe this is too much and I need to step away from the computer and I will watch the replay later of this webinar, right? Be okay with that. As long as you commit to wanting to come back to this, to say, I want to challenge myself to learn a little bit more about myself, learn a little bit more how this impacts people around me in my work, in my workplace, the people I care about, the community I care about. And then how can I do this in a way that doesn't just feel like I'm beating myself up? Right? So we need to take pauses, to take moments to take care of self. So moving into this recognition piece, like what are some tasks, some expectations or guidelines that you might have within your own role that maybe they determine how you prioritize your work, right? So we may have these tasks, these areas of focus that we are called to do depending on your job, where you work within behavioral health organization and have that focus, well, having that focus can feel a little bit less overwhelming if we also understand how we can tackle some of these areas of bias, of hardship, right? Because sometimes we want to focus on, well, I've got to focus here, and um, it can all feel overwhelming, right? So there are small steps. Let's take some small steps to commit to the process of talking about bias around privilege. Um, we can have different approaches to the tasks that we work on. Again, who do you trust to hold you accountable in a kind way? Like I said earlier, once we start talking about awareness and acknowledging bias, even privilege, acknowledging that there are things like discrimination and racism, um, transgenderism, transphobia, I was trying to think of the word. Once we start to recognize those things, what can we do about it? What can we do in this work? And again, remember, who do you have to help you out with these things? In your personal life, maybe also in the workplace. Maybe this is something you're taking into the workspace around. I'm noticing some things that I would like to see different in my workplace, or in how we do business. And who do you go to? Who do you feel safe to connect with and say, I want to have a different kind of conversation. I want to have a different way of how we accept people into our community care space. Maybe you have an office that welcomes people for treatment, for care, for meetings, and maybe you're noticing some things that don't feel as inclusive, as welcoming to everyone, right? So maybe it's having that conversation. Do you feel capable? Do you feel you can? Do you have people you think are willing to hear you? And if it's not, what does that look like? How do you find people to help you in this, right? Because it can feel easy once we start to hit some barriers to say, well, I tried, did my best. What can I do? Along this recognition piece, we also have to recognize and acknowledge that our interactions with our coworkers, do we see diversity of how we do that, right? I mentioned affinity groups earlier, and those coworker groups. Do we recognize how maybe we interact with folks? How maybe we don't interact, or we're very isolated in certain pods, in certain settings, or we only hear from people from this particular group. And is there a specific reason? Is it possible to hear more perspective? Are we open to it? How diverse are your approaches to the work, to your engagement with clients, to information that we provide to people? Recognize maybe we're not hitting the mark, right? I don't know the different areas you may be working in, but I do know that they can be very diverse and very diverse from who you are individually. And so maybe you're going in, sharing lots of ideas to folks who are just like, look, I say no because I don't know what you're talking about. I'm used to it one way, right? Maybe they have their own bias about what this looks like. Maybe you're being received in a very discriminatory way. Like, you're coming in here with some new ideas that's not for us. And how do we have that conversation, right? So recognizing those things may come up. How do we have those conversations? I have to recognize the areas that I want to focus on. Maybe we can't tackle it all. Maybe it starts small within our work groups and how we have different and engaging conversations to take in diverse perspective within our small team staffings, for example. Maybe I'm going to start thinking about each of the clients, each of the people I get to serve and support and work with, and I'm going to start to think, is it possible there's a bias along the way? Are there things that maybe I haven't offered to this person? Maybe I'm offering to this other person that I didn't offer here. Let me just take a pause and think, why might that be? Are there some very real reasons why maybe I did take into consideration who they are and what they are open to, and their culture, who they are as a whole person? but maybe I didn't, right? So having some more intentionality of that work that we do as behavioral health professionals. The action piece. So when we are at that point of like, I want to get into like, I want to be about what I've been thinking about and in my own head about, I'm acknowledging my bias. I want to do something, right? We have to be intentional and very mindful about a plan to do this. We can't just say, well, I used to have a bias against people who had extremely long hair, and now I'm just going to say, I love everyone with long hair, and I'm just gonna just go in willy-nilly without really thinking about things, right? Like we got to have a strategy. Let's really give more than just the, oh, I did this before, and now I'm not going to do it. What's the meaning behind it? What does that mean for the person? What does that mean for you? Let's really be clear and sincere about that practice. What's your strategy to acknowledge, identify, act on uh, overcoming the biases that may be experienced by you or other people in your agency or organization? I'm sure there are occasions where you've seen something happen or you're like, I'm aware that there seems to be a bias being playing out for this person that's impacting this other coworker, and we see it. And do we feel we can say something? Does it feel like it's our place? Sometimes we get caught up in that. There's some great books out there that are talk about addressing bias, overcoming bias, subtle acts of exclusion, as Tiffany Jana mentions in some of her books, also known as microaggressions. Because I like subtle acts of exclusion because it actually tells you what you're doing. You're othering a person, right? Microaggressions for some people feel so hard to talk about. Oh, how do I know I did it? Well, if we think about it as excluding someone, we are othering them. Like, oh, your hair, it's so exotic looking and so different and it's so beautiful. I'm giving you a compliment, but it can also feel like, oh, I am not the norm, right? Sometimes we may be coming with the best of intention that still has impact. And can we do that? Can we acknowledge that kind of work? And in doing that, what do we do about it? Do we just say, well, I'm just not going to say anything. I'll just stay quiet. I won't speak to anyone because apparently I'm going to say the wrong thing and now everybody is offended. I think we hear that a lot today, especially as new generations come up into the workplace, into society with different perspectives, new perspectives, sometimes not so new, but just a different generation sharing it. I sometimes hear that in different behavioral health spaces, like, oh, here we go. This is what's trending. And that can also be a bias, right? Of this new information that, here they go. They're going to disrupt things. But is that always bad? Does it keep us on our toes and keep us really thinking about all people, right? All the possibilities. Am I really open to it? Or am I kind of closing myself off because it's just a trend? It'll go away soon, or it almost dismisses and diminishes what folks are talking about. Um, if you work for an agency or an organization who wants to be anti-racist or more inclusive, who wants to be an anti-oppressive workplace, this is kind of important to do, right? How can we just put that statement out there for people without demonstrating the work that we're actually doing to get there? That's huge. We need to think about that. People will look to see, well, what are you doing about it? I'm just not being biased. What does that look like? I'm just not being judgmental. Well, how do I know? Just because you say so? And so this is getting us into that place of how do I acknowledge what do I recognize in myself, in the workplace, and others in my work with folks? What did I identify? What did I identify in those areas, and what can I do about it? Even if it's small, right? Every change is a step in a direction to something new. Not necessarily better, just something new, right? Which gives us more information, access to more information. We get more information about ourselves, more information about our coworkers, the people we work with, people we support within our behavioral health work, more information about our society, our community, how our workplace receives the things that we are highlighting that maybe need to be addressed, right? It all gives us more information to get to the next best place. And so I think that's important to recognize for us. Is there a space for discussion? Maybe you're a leader at your organization, or you sit very close to the leaders and the managers and supervisors or directors. Is there space for discussion about these things? Does it feel like we don't talk about it? I know in some organizations, people feel like, oh, if you say bias, if you say racism, people start to look like, where's HR? Are they in the room? I'm scared. Did I say the wrong thing? Do we have space for that? Is it possible to say, who are the people who can talk about this? Do we have a committee? Do we have a group? If we want to be that type of organization that's more inclusive, anti-oppressive workplace that says we are working, we are committed to being anti-racist, or whatever the work is that you want to provide to folks and be more inclusive and support this idea of non-judgmental, unbiased work. Are you doing what it takes to get there? And how do you demonstrate that to people? I think that's important to know. And if you have that kind of space where you work, great. Are you part of it? Do you feel only certain people can be part of it? Sometimes in some settings, some organizations feel like it should be people of the global majority or people of color who, well, you tell us what you'd like to see different. Shouldn't we all be included? Anti-oppression doesn't just happen to people of the global majority or to people of color. Think of how transgender rights are being impacted across not just our nation, but the world. And so all we all have people in our life or ourselves, like part of that community, right? So to say only people of color or only a certain group, also, why should we put the people who are being most oppressed or most marginalized at the forefront of determining what you need to do to be better for them? Let's think about that, right? And if that's our thought process, let's just take a minute to like unpack that a little bit. Why is it up to them? Why do I need to tell you how to care about me? I feel like you should be invested in caring about me just as I am invested in caring about each of you. And that takes work on both of our parts, right? So really thinking about, what does this take within the work that we do? Do we have space to make missteps within our work? What if there is a microaggression? Someone made a statement, someone, even with land acknowledgements, I will say I've had folks defer to me and they say, oh, Bianca's in the room. Come do the land acknowledgement for us. We can all acknowledge the people who came before us. We can all take up the space to say, I just want to give this acknowledgement and I want to do better and be a better steward, be good stewards moving into this community, especially if it's not a community I'm part of. We can all do that. We're not a monolith. Every Indigenous Native person or tribal affiliated person, we're not all the same. Every person who identifies as a Mexican or Mexican American or Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx, like for within my community of care, we're not all the same. And so how I acknowledge, how I recognize is from my point of view, and a person who may look like me may have a very different point of view. And so we need to be mindful of that, even if you are a person who identifies as white or is not a person of color, right? Like your thoughts are just as important in this discussion to move things forward. And I know that's a tricky thing to say because people feel like, how do we amplify the voice? Well, maybe there's a need for both. There's a need for both to be true. We need to leave space for people to feel that, the people who don't get to have their voices amplified as much in your organization or your community. Leave space for that, and also create space for people who identify as white, who may want to have these discussions, but are fearful in those other spaces, right? Like, oh, I'm being told to step back. Maybe we need to create some space to have those conversations where you can be open and honest and intentional about it, but also in community to say, like, I know lots of people who feel, well, I can't say anything because I'm white, and if I talk about how hard this is for me, then all I'm going to hear is, well, it's harder for me. And yes, that does happen. So do we need space in the learning aspect, right? Of where can I have a brave space to talk about these things and also be capable of learning, right? We all need to have space for that. So do our organizations support that? Are we connected to other community settings that maybe provide these opportunities, even if it's a book club, right? And even if it's a virtual space to check in with folks, to have good conversation that challenges us, that speaks to this shift, this change forward. Even if it's virtual, that's okay. Even if it's a webinar, like, I want to listen in, I'm going to do some work, and I want to talk with others who maybe did this work, who are on this journey. That's okay. I think we need to be okay with that. I think sometimes in this process, we get scared. We feel like we're going to be judged. We need to think about the impact, right? What it has on all of these types of roles that we may be part of, that we may work in, we work alongside. Think about the impact it plays on all of these roles, on the relationship between each other. Think about people that we serve, and think about maybe some bias that comes up, some impact, even some things that maybe you've done and you realize now, oh my gosh, I wonder if this impacted them the way I'm seeing it could have now. Are we able to take stock and look at that? Do we consider barriers that bias places on folks? Think about these administration, HR, recruitment opportunities, operations folks, those coordinators of trying to get more clinicians, more social workers, right? What does that process look like? Is there potential bias? Are we looking only for certain degrees? Are we looking for only certain numbers of years? We're looking for only certain schools, right? There may be a very valid reason for doing some of these things, but does it also start to then filter into more and more bias that really focuses in who's able to apply? And then when you look at the scope of who the demographics are within that makeup, is that impacting trying to get a more diverse workforce to sit in front of a more diverse population of people we may be serving? I don't know, things to consider, right? Maybe you've got a very good reason why we do things the way we do. By all means, do that. This is just to consider, are there things we could be looking at differently? Do I view social workers, when I think of social workers, is there a particular person I see in my mind? When I think of a supervisor, a leader, somebody in charge, is there a particular person I see in mind? Could I be excluding people unknowingly? When I work alongside certain ABA therapists, are there certain ways of work and modalities or things that they do that I really appreciate and see as those are the people? And do we ignore others who maybe are still in the learning or have just other unique techniques? Are we kind of excluding them? Things to consider as we talk about bias in the work that we do. We can't talk about bias without talking about privilege, right? It plays a role. It plays a role in our work. Have we taken stock of what impact our own privilege has as we come into the work? And again, privilege is just acknowledging that we have different things that we come into the world with, into the workspace, into community space with. As an able-bodied person, even though I live with chronic pain, I know I still have privilege. With other folks that I encounter within my workplace in different training settings, I have to be very mindful when I do in-person trainings, things that I maybe years ago didn't consider. I just assumed people will figure it out for themselves, or they will tell us if they need something. Early on, I didn't even think about what if you don't feel comfortable. And I'm a person who doesn't always feel comfortable saying, I need something different. And I just had not connected it till I started doing more of this work. And also, I'm still learning. So never let that be a thing as though you get to this place of, I'm there, got it, not racist, not biased. I know my privilege, I know the impact, I know how I need to move about the world. Still at risk of committing mistakes, of saying something harmful, hurtful, that has impact on another, and still working on how I receive feedback and then what do I do with that? And so we have to acknowledge the privilege that we have, especially in this work. People are coming to us needing help, needing support, needing care, having some real severe safety needs. And we owe them to kind of check ourselves before we enter their space and do some work with them, right? So it's something to consider. We can't ignore it. Privilege is real. Also, we all have it in some way. We may have some things that look different and maybe you feel like, well, I don't have a privilege in this aspect. Okay, but where do you? Let's just be real about it and acknowledge it, because sometimes that can factor in to some of the bias, some of the impact that we may have on others in the work that we do. What does it mean to be culturally thoughtful and culturally affirming when we do this work? We need to be mindful of our own bias and privilege, because how we approach folks is important to take into consideration with cultural humility. Do we know that we don't know everything about everyone? That idea of cultural competence that's an interesting statement, to be culturally competent. Even within my own communities, again, we're not a monolith. There's so much difference, so much nuance, depending on the location, the environment you grew up in, the areas of you, all the intersections of who you are, right? And there's so much more to learn. I can't go in assuming. Are we able to say, I'm not going to go in assuming? Are we able to create space for people to just be human and for us to be open to understanding who they are as humans, all of who they are, all the intersections, all those life domains? It's not just one way. Am I open to hearing about them? Am I open to learning in a way that's not treating them as the other, as, oh, that's different. Oh, that's weird, right? Things that feel so benign, yet can impact people. Weird. I, someone had told me that it was weird to eat with your hands, but how I grew up was I didn't use utensils a particular way. I didn't use them all the time. And so then being around this group of people, or around a person who had a very different upbringing, that was very cultured. I joke with them. Their knife and fork a particular way, and where they grew up across the pond was just like, whoa. It kind of made me feel bad, and I just did some thinking about it, and we would have a conversation. I came up in a different culture, a different setting than they did, and that's okay. And so do we make space for people to share those things with us and how it feels? And maybe I don't want to tell you this is how I grew up, because I feel like maybe you will think less of me. You will consider me less of a person, less of a human, less of somebody worth listening to. Coming back to why it's important, right? All of these things require relationship. When we do this kind of work, behavioral health, mental health, any type of community care, it requires relationship building. We have to build respectful, culturally affirming, and trusting relationships with people. And those folks may be coming to us seeking compassion, support. They need individualized plans. These need to speak to some real big safety needs. Maybe there's some high risk for them, for where they live, what they're going through. They want to create some goals, how they have strengths. Are we able to do our own work to be able to see those strengths? That requires us to think about the barriers to getting to that place of building strong relationships. A lot of that has to do with some bias, recognizing our own privilege, how that all impacts the work that we do. There's this is a book, it's called Heal Your Way Forward by Maisha T. Hill. And in her book, there's this quote, she just talks about that there are typically spoken or unspoken agreements in place that allow members to feel a sense of agency, support, and collective responsibility that help them build reciprocal, restorative relationships. So as we circle it back to why this is important, that's why it's important. People are trusting us. They come to us with these big needs. They're trusting that we have not just an answer, and we may not have the answer, but can we create space where they feel trusting, they feel like they're being listened to completely, that we are taking into account all of the things that are impacting them in their life, their environment, who they are, how they're seen within the world. And I just think that that's really important to consider. And lastly, as a big thank you for being here. A reflection I'd love to share with you is that we are always a reflection of the light that we give. So how do we reflect the light, the heart within us? How do we reflect that light upon others to amplify their voice, highlight who they are, demonstrate the love, the light, and the service to others, right? We work in fields in this profession that requires us to be there for folks, and we want to amplify those voices, and we claim that we want to be there to do something different and offer something different. And so what does that look like? How does that look in practice? Right. So just something to leave you with. And again, I appreciate you all being here. The last slide is really just a couple of the books that I love these are things I constantly go back to. I constantly go back to say, there was this one thing that I want to reference or that I remember, or that just helps me stay focused within this work. And so that's included in the slides. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and leave space.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Setting up my computer here really quickly, so sorry. I do have a couple of questions. And please, everyone, do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A as we go through here, if you do have any. So first question is, do you have examples of strategies for acknowledging biases and connecting to people or clients who are from different backgrounds?
Okay, so say that one more time.
Yeah, do you have examples of strategies for acknowledging biases in how to connect with people or clients from different backgrounds? So I guess just asking for strategies. I know you put some resources up there, reading material, but are there other strategies that you know of that would help someone in acknowledging biases?
So I think it really is a tricky thing, right? Because it's like, well, how do you acknowledge bias, or how do you work through it? We got to acknowledge it first. We have to be able to know that it's there. And so if I think about the questions highlighting people from different backgrounds, number one, whoever is in front of you, if they're different from you, if you're acknowledging or recognizing they're different from you, are you able to think and consider, are there things that I'm assuming already about them? Are there things that I've already come to think about that maybe this is how I would treat them. This is how I'm going to speak to them. This is the information I'm prepared to share with them. I think about the different types of biases. So if we work in the healthcare setting, am I pressed for time? So I start to pre-assume, I start to prejudge who this person is. Oh, they have this diagnosis, or they come from this part of town, or they're from this tribe, or they look this way, or I know their history, so I know what I'm going to say. And so if we find ourselves already thinking, I've got this, I'm going to phone this one in, ooh, maybe stop and take a minute. What am I already assuming that I know about them that maybe they haven't provided information to me on? That's a great way to start, right? Like, what have I already started to write a treatment plan on, or write a script, or give some advice on before they've even entered the space to tell me anything? Secondly, if they do share information saying, oh, this is new information that I'm learning about you. This is new information that I'm not familiar with. And I think being humble enough to say, wow, this is new information I want to learn more about, and I'm going to do my own research about, but I appreciate you sharing with me more about you, right? Because what we want to do is learn about the person. They, you know, someone can say, oh, I'm from this particular part of town. It's like when I have a lot of friends from California who say, oh, I'm from LA. And as though that's supposed to mean something to me. I'm not from California or from LA, but people from LA in different parts will say, oh, I know what you're talking about. I know something about people from there, right? They're kind of already prejudging. They have this idea of what to expect. As professionals, though, we can go into our work already pre-written treatments or pre-written ideas of what I'm going to offer to you, as though it's one size fits all. So I think those are some initial steps when meeting with folks who are maybe obviously different from us. I don't know what that means to people, but who come in maybe speaking different languages. If you need an interpreter, assuming you guys just got to talk louder, doesn't mean anything to them. I have family members in other countries who say Americans just talk louder. They talk so loud, and it's because they just assume we just like to talk loud, and it's like, oh, I think they think talking louder means you'll understand them better. But getting to know more about the person, and again, being humble enough to say, have I started to come up with some ideas, answers of a prescription, like to say, before I've even listened to them? And if they share new information, can I say, can you tell me a little bit more about what that means to you? Like, not just I'm Indigenous. Oh, okay. And not assume you know what that means, but maybe say, what does that mean to you, right? And to get some more understanding, how do you tie that? Is it food related? Is it like culturally, it's like food connects our family. And to learn a little bit more and then think, oh, can I connect with that? Is that meaningful to me? I can see how this is meaningful to this person. I think sometimes it really is pretty simple. It's building relationship with people. What if I care to offer the best service, I want to know about you. And so those would be the things to start with for me.
That's great. And it's so important. I love what you said kind of in the beginning of how, we get into this work, we get into this field. If we're in inpatient or outpatient, a lot of times we are pressed for time. We definitely have forms, notes, things we need to fill out,
Absolutely.
boxes we need to check, unfortunately. And we do stop that curiosity sometimes, as you said, oh, I'm checking this, you're Indigenous, or this box, but what does that really mean to that person? That is so important, just to take that extra time, the extra minute, 2 minutes. So important.
Yeah.
And kind of gets into our next question too, a little bit. This is more kind of about definitions. But can you help this? So can you help us to understand the difference between bias and transference and countertransference?
Ooh.
All very related. Yes, I looked up definitions too as this question came in. It's a great question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Yeah, so I'm trying to think. Because I just look at bias for what it is, taking out of
Mhm.
context mental health, um, interactions with folks, and really just think, is there something that's creating a barrier to me being as open to strategizing with this person as possible? right? So if I'm meeting with someone and there are things that I'm like, oh, maybe it's their how they present as their gender or their identity, and that it starts to make me feel something, right? That's really how I view this idea of bias in the workplace for myself, because is it something that I'm feeling like it's going to be a barrier for me to move forward and ask different questions? Am I hesitant to ask certain questions with this person because I'm assuming some information about them already, right? And so transference, oh yeah, I think that's where I get a little like, I don't know how I would want to throw that in here. I think it is different, right? Because yes, we can have feelings. We can have feelings that have come up for us. Past experiences can create bias, right? Past experience, harmful experiences can, or interactions with people, maybe from a particular demographic, from, things maybe have occurred and happened. And rightfully so, to feel strong feelings for what may have occurred, right? But that may also, and I should say, and it may also create some bias. Like, oh, well, now I have some strong feelings about people from this, who look like this, who identify this way, or who speak a certain way, who wear these certain things, or whatever it is. We can start to create a bias of expectation from people that we see as similar to somebody who may have impacted us at some point through some event. I think they are connected. That's how I would differentiate those two. Somewhat, I don't know if this answers their question, but that's kind of how I make sense of it. Transference is an interesting word that comes up a lot in different workplace settings that I work within, or I support, or I train, or facilitate. And so that's interesting. This is the first time I've had somebody ask that in combination with bias conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I looked up the definitions, just to remind myself, transference, countertransference, we hear it all throughout school.
Mhm.
Um, Bias definitely, I feel, connected more with countertransference than the transference. But it was interesting, and it's a great question, and absolutely something to look up and look into.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm. A couple more questions, and I apologize too for my internet and Zoom kicking me out, but I'm back. Do you have any suggestions for reaching into, quote, white fragility, resistance to even considering the existence of implicit bias?
Mm. So reaching in, I'm assuming, is maybe,
Sorry, reacting. I'm so
oh,
sorry. Any
okay.
suggestions for reacting to white fragility? So maybe someone who's resistant to even considering the existence of implicit bias.
Yeah, I think, and this is again with lots of work, and there are points where I'm like, out of frustration, right? We get frustrated and I'm like, why isn't this person just getting it? But we're human. We're all human. And the reality is colonialism, white supremacy affects all of us, including white people. Like, we are all harmed by it. You think about patriarchy, how harmful that is on even men, what they can do, right? So all of these things we have to acknowledge impact all of us. We are all harmed by it. And part of that harm is that it wants to separate us. And it's us versus them, and it's a your fault, not mine. You owe me. And sometimes that stops conversation and understanding that we are all human. I think that's the first step. Is I have to sometimes, when I have encountered someone who is, I'm constantly trying to reframe, but I'll just use the word they use, resistant, to their beliefs are just different, right? They believe something. They are holding on to it for a reason, right? No different than other folks we work with. in mental health where they're holding on to something for a reason, right? There's something that has served them there, that's why they're holding on to it. There's something that they have received benefit from, that they have been maybe positively reinforced. They've received something that they're holding on to, or maybe it's for survival of some kind for them. And so sometimes we have to offer that grace to other people. It's real easy to say we all need to do better and everybody needs to learn and get over it and just do the work. We're human. This stuff is hard. And that's why I said earlier, maybe it's figuring out how do we create space. I've heard the challenges with having a space for people who are not white and a space for people who are white to tackle similar conversations. And I've heard people say, oh, that just is so divisive. But it also, we need to consider, do people feel like that's the space they can learn and unlearn and have some hardship before they come back together? We gotta consider that. And I think having that initial reaction or response to somebody as like, you just got to do it, or this is somebody who's going to take a little bit more time to get to a space of learning. And ultimately, I usually just try to look at this as this is a person having a very human experience about this conversation, and there's got to be a reason. And so maybe asking, like, what is maybe if they've not given you any answers, or if they haven't given you enough information to find out, like, why maybe they're holding on to this. Why do they hold on so strongly to that belief? How has it served them up to this point? And that might be the starting point to understand a little bit more about them. There's a reason they're holding on to this.
Mhm. Absolutely. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, and somebody had just put in the Q&A, very compassionate and inclusive answer, and they thank you.
Again, we work in behavioral health, and initially, sometimes those initial statements can feel like, damn it, you just got to learn. You just got to get with the program. But again, we're all human. We have to leave room for that human experience. And if I want others to take time to get to know me, then I better be prepared to do the same. And yeah, that's why I say it that way. That's how I feel about it.
Thank you. Um, do you have any tips or approaches to address low or unacceptable performance fairly and without perception of bias?
Mm, I
So when you're
think
doing an
that's,
evaluation or
yeah,
right performance review.
okay. Yeah, this is, I mean, I did a lot of talking about this even outside of the webinar from yesterday
Mhm.
around having those accountability. What does your agency organization have as accountability checklist or those strict guidelines and rules? And then if you are a supervisor of someone, if you are in charge of something, if there's some strict guidelines that you have, maybe outlining it. And something that I always found helpful for me, especially at times when I supervised people who were different from me or who I felt like looked at me as, oh, I think you're going to be treating this other person who looks like you a little bit differently. Something I would do was just to make sure I'm providing the same information to everyone and to clarify, here's the expectation across the board. And if you're below that line, if you're not meeting that expectation, here's the next step, because that kind of helped me feel like I'm giving everyone the information. I'm giving all of you the opportunity to navigate my expectations or the organization's expectations. And so then when it's time to have a review, there are some things I can say. These are the clear lines we have to follow. These are the clear guidance we've had. This is what I've demonstrated to you over and over. Here's some data, maybe, to say this is where you're not meeting something, but I'm going to be kind to say, well, how can I support you? Maybe it's offering a plan to get to the next step. Because sometimes I've found that offering an opportunity to strategize with the person on meeting an expectation leaves room for them to share maybe why they can't, maybe why it's too hard, maybe this is no longer working for them. And then that gives us room to go to a different type of conversation. Maybe this is no longer the space for you. Maybe this is no longer the job for you. As a person, I want to support you doing what you want to do. And as somebody in a position of leadership or supervision, I also have to hold the organizational standards in alignment too. So I think I'm a big fan of giving people the information they need to know up front. Here's what I'm looking for. If you have questions, come to me. Let's make space to talk. When it comes review time, I'm pulling data. I'm pulling like, here's what we've worked on. Let's try a strategy. If a review comes after, then I'm saying, here's the data. Here's what I gave you. This is where we're going with it.
Absolutely. I love that. And that, like you said, bringing in concrete information, this is the rules or the procedures, policies we have to abide by. Everybody knows the same information across the board. And this is the data to back it up. And I've been in situations like that too, where also it is important to, talk to the person too. Maybe they're not meeting those markers, and let's figure out why. So quickly off track, had a situation where a person wasn't, meeting productivity or not answering emails properly. And, we figured out 2 screens, 2 monitors was better for this person and worked better. And sure enough, productivity, everything's great. Everything's perfect. So just taking that time to understand what are the needs of that person and how can we meet their needs to get them where they need to go.
Again, using those steps of like kind curiosity, help me understand what's happening here. How can I support you? Let's figure out how to improve this situation, right? It works in those situations with staff that you're supervising as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have any more questions in the box. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the presentation. And I want to thank everybody absolutely for taking this time to be here today with us on Friday afternoon. Definitely appreciate it. I am going to put up a slide really quickly with our QR code for our evaluation. Those that are still here, please do fill out the evaluation. It really helps us. It helps our, presenters learn what they're doing great at and how to better meet the needs of the audience, or how to tweak things a little bit to make it better. So we would really appreciate everybody filling that out. And thank you everybody for being here today.